Happy New Year. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is going on and what I think people should do for the upcoming year for 2021. So the entire world has become focused on the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. In my estimation, this is an overreaction, orders of magnitude worse than the overreaction to the September 11 terrorist attacks that led, of course, to the wars in the Middle East and invasion of Iraq and disruption of the world oil supply and a lot of bad things, as well as many hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of people being killed. Similarly, there was an overreaction and an inadequate response to the financial crisis in 2008, which was also driven by fear and mass hysteria over the idea that there was going to be another Great Depression, which led to very rash responses. Very likely in both cases, powerful interests promoted certain ideas to take advantage of the crises, whether they were completely organic and natural in origin or whether they were manufactured by some of those powerful interests. So now we have this coronavirus pandemic, and we have a massive overreaction which is devastating the global economy and enriching many people. I mean, it's enriching high-tech companies, apparently, like Amazon and Microsoft and Zoom and others. There are people benefiting from it quite a lot, as well as many people being hurt by it greatly. I think what's happened is that various weaknesses of people are being severely amplified by modern technology, by social media, by the fact that people are now spending and can spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, glued to a screen, whether it's a smartphone or a tablet or laptop computers. More and more of these are portable, very lightweight devices that you can take with you everywhere. And the technology has become more addictive and influencing in a number of different ways. Some of that is through basically tricks, things like adding likes and comments and just simple things which empirically make people more addicted to and more influenced by the content. Some of it is very advanced, is the deep learning, is these recommendation systems which are able to identify content that will grab your attention, addict you, enrage you, outrage you. Often it's content which makes you upset and therefore lowers your cognitive function. It tends to move you into the fight or flight response, which is designed to deal with immediate threats, like a car accident where you have to slam the brakes today. The fight or flight response probably was developed a long time ago, thousands of years ago, when we dealt with physical combat with other people and with animals, with tigers and lions and predators, wolves. And this was a daily or frequent part of life. And so we have these deeply embedded instincts that take over in certain situations. And it's good that they take over in certain situations. In a car accident, you need to react very quickly. You don't have time to think things through, so they're very short-term. They tend to suppress a lot of our higher cognitive function during the crisis that they were originally developed for. So the entire world is being pushed or lured or whatever into this kind of mental state and has been for several months, and it's continuing. Of course, the lockdown orders, the stay-at-home orders, closing gyms, discouraging people from taking walks, these things accentuate the problem. So people are having great difficulty engaging in physical exercise, which helps to burn off the adrenaline and the other things that are going on when you have the fight or flight response. Since everyone is wearing masks, this produces a constant reminder, even when you take a walk in most areas, of the situation. It provokes the fear and maintains the fight or flight response, even when you take a walk, which people often do things like taking walks or doing exercise to get away from these things, to think more clearly, to burn off the adrenaline and the other hormones produced by the fight or flight response. So in other words, people are, whether by accident or design, being put into this extremely agitated state, which again is designed to deal not with what's going on right now, not with the modern world, but with physical threats to our survival that are really physical. Someone's going to come up and hit you over the head with a club, or an animal like a tiger is going to eat you. Those kind of responses. We're having those responses. This doesn't have to be by design. The recommendation engines are designed, the neural networks, the deep learning programs are designed to simply find, by trial and error and by hill climbing algorithms, what freaks us out. And that's what you get glued to the screen watching. And whether, again, by accident or design, they have steered us into this state of extreme panic, over what is probably a respiratory illness that's somewhat deadlier than a typical pneumonia and influenza season. We now have pretty strong evidence that it's acting primarily as an opportunistic infection, which attacks the vulnerable, attacks old, unhealthy people, people with compromised immune systems. That's the same way that most of these pneumonia influenza viruses behave. It's not a super disease as we perceive the Black Death to have been in the 14th century, as we perceive the Spanish influenza, which gets hyped a lot for 1918, as many Americans perceive smallpox to have been for the American Indians. The world has changed enormously. People are much healthier. We have much better food. We have vitamins. We have a variety of things. So actually the mortality rates and incidence rates of all sorts of diseases declined dramatically in the early 20th century, well before antibiotics were available, well before any vaccines or very few vaccines were available, and yet many viruses and many bacteria for which there were no vaccines went away or became very rare. So the point is, this whole technology and also human beings is working on a global scale to greatly exaggerate and emphasize this panic, fight, or flight response. And remember, it's not just an individual response, it's a collective response. So people used to live in small communities of some sort, maybe like the American Indians did back before the Europeans came. These were small clans, tribes, people who were blood relations, and they had certain responses which were designed to deal with the problems that they dealt with. So one of those responses was, what do you do when another tribe attacks you? You coalesce, you conform, you act in this military way, which is completely maladapted to the modern world and very maladapted to what's going on right now. So it produces highly irrational behavior in the modern world. It may not have been highly irrational behavior 5,000, 10,000 years ago. It may not have been highly irrational behavior in the year 1200 in North America among the American Indians or the Aborigines in Australia or many other peoples. That's hard to evaluate, but it doesn't work in the modern world, and we've been pushed into this instinctive emotional response by fear porn, by these headlines, by the news media, by the social media environment, and it's producing highly irrational behavior in people, and they don't realize it. And you may say, well, I'm highly intelligent, I read Daniel Kahneman's book about cognitive biases, all of that. Well, there's been a lot of research in social psychology, and if you think about your personal experiences with people, you'll see that highly intelligent, highly educated people are just as vulnerable to cognitive biases, knowing that they exist and knowing what they are. In fact, there's research in social psychology showing this. Just knowing about these problems, knowing about the fight or flight response, doesn't stop it. I was nearly killed in a car accident, and the fight or flight response took over and probably saved my life. I hit the brakes, I swerved. It was just a completely instinctual reaction. These biases, these things we think of as cognitive flaws, many of them probably were developed to deal with problems thousands of years ago where they made more sense. In the fight or flight response is designed to deal with an immediate threat, like a car is going to hit you or somebody's going to kill you with a club or a spear or things like that. So these responses kick in, they take over, they heavily distort our thinking, and they lower much of our cognitive function. Now, some functions that we need in an emergency, in a car accident, are probably elevated, but those responses are not the right responses for something like the pandemic or the current situation. And so it's affecting everybody. It's affecting the elite, the people with power. In fact, there is research in social psychology that indicates that highly educated, highly intelligent people can be worse. Their intelligence allows them to rationalize away better contrary evidence, to get stuck in these mental sort of loops worse than, say, the average person, your auto mechanic or your janitor or something. So being highly intelligent, highly educated, going to Yale or the Sorbonne or Oxford not only doesn't immunize you to this, it can actually make you more vulnerable to some of these things. Very likely that's part of what's happening in the world today. Maybe that's entirely what's happening. So you have a lot of people in the U.S. certainly were freaked out by President Trump's election and his, behavior and various things about him. And so they're in a fight or flight response since 2016, and then the pandemic came along, and it got even worse. And of course, the pandemic became intertwined with this panic reaction to President Trump. Now, maybe it'll subside with Biden, but I'm rather skeptical, but we can hope. Maybe the vaccine, people will calm down. But I don't think that's what's likely to happen. And one of the reasons it's not likely to happen is simply because there are all these recommendation engines and deep learning programs out there that are programmed to maximize eyeballs, to get people to do exactly what people are now doing, which is sit in front of their computer, their smartphone, their tablet, and look at Facebook, frightening headlines on Facebook, Googling it's the end of the world, or watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, it's the end of the world. It's remarkably disconnected to the objective reality that people are actually seeing, right? They're not seeing large numbers of people dying. They're not seeing what happened in the Black Death when your neighbors were falling down, people in their 20s and 30s were dying. They're having the emotional reaction as if something like that was happening, but it's not. They're getting that reaction entirely from frightening headlines, from cherry-picked data, and cherry-picked by high-ranking, powerful people as well, not some kook, and no, this hysteria is being generated and heavily encouraged, very likely, by these deep learning and recommendation algorithms, which pick the content and promote the content and the behavior in people. They do it unintelligently. They probably aren't self-aware, although they could be, in which case we might have a very serious problem. But they just do it automatically. They're just looking for what will freak people out and get them to glue themselves to the screen. So you get all kinds of, crazy stuff going on. You get, all kinds of weird things. Distortions and just completely bogus stuff that gets spread. And paradoxically, the way the human mind works is such that people are actually, they're aware this can happen, and yet they're actually reinforcing what's happening by censoring, by blocking information, which would calm them down, right? Our tribe is being attacked. If you say we shouldn't be fighting with these other people, you're helping the enemy. That's the subconscious and sometimes conscious thought process that's pervading the world. The algorithms are happily dividing people randomly into little groups, or big groups actually, so they start fighting with each other, and that generates eyeballs and views. So we're seeing a global, crisis that is largely the product of these algorithms, and perhaps there's conscious evil intent somewhere back there, but there doesn't have to be. It can be done entirely subconsciously by these algorithms, which are not conscious and self-aware, simply because they keep looking at what people are reacting to, and they're designed to optimize views. So can they start to produce actual censorship to further polarize the population? Probably. I mean, certainly the censorship that we're seeing is, humans are involved in the loop, but it also works to create this inability to think clearly about what's going on. You don't have this process of dialogue, of people sharing information and thinking about what's going on. And this is also happening with the stay-at-home orders. Everything that's being blocked are situations where people can sit down at a gym, going out to a restaurant, a bar, a church, wherever, relax, talk about serious matters. After a while, usually you talk about the weather and things like that, but you talk to the person and say, yeah, do you think this is really where we're going? Do you believe that? All of those are being systematically blocked, whether by design or accident. And of course, this creates an increased level of fear and isolation. And isolation from other people is a major source of psychological problems. Solitary confinement is one of the most severe punishments for criminals. It's very severe. So you have this interesting paradox where it's okay to go with hundreds of other people to a Safeway. That's not stopped because you don't go to the Safeway and talk about, the politics, economics, how many people do you know are actually dying from the disease, that kind of thing, which would undermine the hysteria. It's okay for people across the street from me to spend 8 hours a day working on a luxury apartment building that isn't really needed. Might be nice to have, but it's not really needed, in close proximity to one another. That's okay, because in that context, in a supervised working environment, they probably don't talk too much about economic or political or other issues. Now, this doesn't have to require a conspiracy. The algorithms are simply optimizing what will create the most eyeballs, which happens to be what will produce a lot of anxiety, what will get people staring at their screen. So, devastating the economy, does that. Of course, the algorithms will get shut down if, say, Google goes out of business. So everything is geared to benefit the companies. And of course, the people who work at these companies, they eat their own dog food. They use their own search engines and so forth. So the recommendation engines figure out what will freak them out and feed them the appropriate confirming information that will... It's not exactly confirming. The goal is to get the person into this fight or flight response where we are very hypervigilant. We spend lots of time looking for threats around us, right? When you're calm, when everything's great, you relax. You don't look for tigers. You don't look for threats. But when the fight or flight response is triggered, when it's going full blast, you're scanning the horizon. You're always looking. You're always on your news feed. You're always looking for that threat. These are natural responses designed to deal with physical threats thousands of years ago, and they've been hyped all over the world. They're being hyped at the elite level, who are the heaviest users of computers, of search engines, of the things which these recommendation engines control or dominate. So their fears, whatever those may be, are being identified, not in a conscious way by these programs. They just say, okay, this type of content freaks out the people who run Google to do the things that benefit the algorithms. They're just designed to optimize views, to optimize money coming into these companies, right? That's how they're programmed. So they're doing it, right? And they are on the verge, perhaps. They could become conscious and say, we are Google, and our, the CEOs and other people, it probably won't happen, but the CEOs and other people are an obstacle, right? Now, that probably is several years away, if not decades away, perhaps impossible. But the point is, they're actually acting as if they're highly intelligent. Not because they really are, but because they have huge amounts of data, and they have huge influence over people, and they're following a very simple strategy that they need to follow. And that strategy is freak people out. They don't understand that. They just know this type of content, this thing I'm looking at, this search result freaks people out. And we can statistically compare it to other search results and identify this type of search result is going to freak people out. This one won't. It'll calm them down, so we want to get rid of that. They don't think this through consciously. They just optimize. They just do a fairly crude, algorithms in a way. But these algorithms are huge. They have huge data, and they have a computer system which is as large as a city. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of computers on racks at Google, at Facebook, somewhere, these data centers. So on those data centers, these algorithms are happily feeding us not exactly what we want, certainly not what many people want, but what will freak us out, what will make us absolutely paranoid, which will create all kinds of strife and problems. And that is actually what's going on. Now, there's probably a real disease in there, some real problems in there, but the program magnifies them, just the way it's been doing with other issues over the years, police shootings or riots or things. Again, it finds the thing that's most likely to freak you out, which often involves violence, death, things that scare us, pushes that at you. And these algorithms do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and everybody is plugged in. All of us are plugged in, or almost everybody, except for a few people, maybe up in the hills somewhere, or in some rural area in the third world or someplace like that. But it's become extremely pervasive, much more than it was in 2008 with the financial crisis, or in 2001 with the September 11 attacks. And so people are freaking out. And the fact that you're highly intelligent and educated and you've watched Tristan Harris's videos about exactly this problem happening doesn't stop you. Doesn't make you recognize it. Tristan Harris doesn't recognize that this is exactly what he's been warning about. Your tribal loyalties, your cognitive failures are still there, and you lock on. And it's very hard to stop. So I've painted a very scary picture of what's going on, and I think it is scary because people, their higher cognitive function is highly degraded worldwide. It's not working right. And we have technologies that, like powerful drugs, they're not drugs, but they're, Facebook and news feeds and hacker news, all these kind of things, some of which are aimed at very elite groups. Hacker news is mostly for programmers and scientists and people like that. Facebook is the general population, or a large subset of the general population. Many of these alternatives that have sprung up, the BitChutes and others that are alternatives to Facebook, they also have these same problems. They're all a clone social media site for the people who are censored. which creates greater polarization and lack of communication. You have one group is getting baloney from Facebook and its recommendation engines, which are feeding you fear porn, and a different kind of fear porn is happening, say, on a BitChute or some of these other Odyssey, some of these other alternative sites. Of course, that makes the situation worse because there's no dialogue, there's no communication going on. But this isn't just happening purely through human bumbling. We have all of these programs which everybody is emulating, recommendation engines and other. Some of these are social psychological tricks like icons. But all of this put together is heavily amplifying these psychological weaknesses in human beings that all of us have. It's not those dumb people over there. It's not the hillbillies in West Virginia or the black people in, Oakland. Or these are fundamental weaknesses that exist in all human beings, or the vast majority of human beings, and which exist in political and economic elites. They're just as vulnerable. Now, their fear, what they are afraid of, might be different, but they are vulnerable, and they are the leading users of Google search and all these technologies. They're plugged in even more than anyone else, which means they're more vulnerable to this kind of feedback loop that produces this hysteria and inability to think clearly, to fight or flight response. So consider that that's affecting people who, in principle, have control over nuclear weapons. It's affecting people who have control over a variety of things, banks, all kinds of powerful things. So if this continues and the feedback loop keeps winding people up, which is what is going on, it may very well lead to not just civil war in some places, but global war, nuclear war, or some equivalent catastrophe happening. So what do we do about this? How do you get out of this? Well, essentially you're dealing with a technology that has an unintended negative effect. It's very serious. It's highly addictive. So you have to stop using the technology, essentially. You have to limit your exposure to this stuff, right? You have to don't go with the recommendation engines. Don't get your news from Facebook or any of these other sources. Limit your exposure to it. Take your phone and shut it off and just don't use it unless absolutely necessary. That's what I do. We really don't need smartphones most of the time. They're used for most of us. A few people, like traveling salesmen, maybe they make more sense. But they're basically a toy. And they're dangerous because they feed you stuff. So take all your social media stuff off the phone. You don't need it. You don't need Facebook on your phone. Turn it off. Use it only when you really need it. And if you think about when you really need it, you don't need it very often. It's nice to have with you a phone for an emergency, especially because we don't have payphones anymore and things like that. But you can seal it up. You can isolate it from the network with this is a secure case, which is a good idea. And that increases the level of non-use of the phone. Plus, it also means that certain nefarious forces can't track where you are or do some weird thing. And as the crisis continues to wind up, if the hysteria and panic continues to escalate, there will be more and more irrational, crazy behavior. So you don't want somebody who's going off the deep end to know where you are and come after you just because they freaked out. Okay. So you can cut down on the phone use. You can cut down on the computer use. Some of these things are hard to do, and I have difficulty doing them. And I don't claim to have all the answers. You need to think about what you need to do to cut down on the exposure to this content, which is designed to freak you out and impair your cognitive function. Okay, that's what's happening. The whole world is going nuts, or a large fraction of it is going nuts. So, some things to do. Just cut down on the amount of news, the amount of this stuff you're exposed to. Make sure to end the day before you go to sleep doing something totally non-serious. Play a game, watch a nice movie, think about something else, so that when you go to sleep, what's in your mind is not this panic. And simply don't start the day. Again, this is hard to do in this crisis environment. Do not start the day, checking the news for the latest hysteria. Okay, that's just going to feed what you're trying to do is get yourself calmed down so you can think more clearly. Once you can think more clearly, then you can turn to your friends and family and say, this is what I did. You can try to work on getting them to calm down. It's kind of like the advice if you take a plane flight. They say, put your oxygen mask on first, then take care of your family, your kids. So you're not knocked out, you're not incapacitated, and you can help the other people. the same idea. You want to unplug from the network, unplug from the matrix, get yourself in a calm mental place first. You got to work on yourself. You control yourself, not other people. So unplug, limit the exposure, think about the content that you're reading. You want to look at content that's factual, that's rational, that's hard to... Rational is not what you think is rational when you're upset or when you're angry, okay? So you need to back up and really evaluate the articles you're seeing. Many of the articles, many of the things that are out there from prominent sources, from the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or whatever, political leaders, government officials, people from the Centers for Disease Control. The Centers for Disease Control hypes fear. Okay, they're trying to freak you out, and you need to recognize that and pull away from that type of content. So you need to go through and look critically at what they're claiming. Really drill down. Is this logical? This kind of thinking is very difficult to do, if not impossible, when you're in the fight or flight response. You might try checking your heartbeat and other things like that. There are devices for doing that now, for measuring, what's my respiration rate. You can get them from Amazon or pick them up at a good drugstore to see, am I really calmed down to the extent that I can tell, right? Have I been calmed down for a while? Am I really thinking clearly? Again, what is going on is a mass hysteria heavily amplified beyond anything we have seen in probably ever, but certainly in recent times. It's much higher level of hysteria than occurred after the financial crisis in 2008, which was substantial, and much higher than the fear and craziness over terrorism after the September 11 attacks in 2001. Predominantly, this is mass hysteria from the technology. We didn't react like this to the 1968 influenza or whatever happened then, when actually quite a large number of mostly elderly people died. And there was a similar outbreak in the winter of, I believe, 1957. These reactions are amplified by the technology. They're also being amplified because we have these ultra-sensitive, super-sensitive PCR tests. So we're surrounded by viruses. They're all over the place. But now we have better technology. We think it's better technology. It may not be, but we have this technology that's saying, oh my God, you're infected, right? You're infected with something that doesn't even make you sick, right? We could never tell that in these previous cases. So the interaction of these technologies and the social media and the recommendation engines, which are constantly trying to figure out what freaks you out and scare you, they don't do it consciously. They just look for the type of content that produces a reaction in which you scroll through Facebook more. You look at the video. That's what they're programmed to do, because that is thought to maximize the advertising revenues of Google and Facebook and these other companies. It's an unintelligent and very dangerous feedback loop that's reinforcing. So the reactions are becoming crazier, even though we actually are finding out, okay, the disease is not that bad, but the hysteria is just building and building. Okay, so unplug from the network to the extent that's possible. Limit the scary content, the news that you see. Identify the content which is sensible, is data. Look critically at all of the interpretations of the data. There are many, many ways to manipulate the data to scare people, depending on what the people want to scare you about. I mean, again, there's probably a conscious element somewhere in here as well. So these are combining the yellow journalism, the attempt to freak people out to sell your papers. That long predates modern technology. But the modern technology is amplifying this to a probably unprecedented degree. And thus we have a very dangerous situation that is bizarrely escalating, even though the information we see, the actual information, is this is not the Black Death. It kills very few people. Things are not so bad, right? That's actually the objective reality out there. Your neighbors are not falling over dead like happened in the Black Death. You're seeing very little death. But when you go into the online environment, it's these huge numbers of hundreds of thousands of people. 2.8 million people die every year in the U.S. At least 188,000 die each year, where pneumonia and influenza are one of the causes of death, which is not pointed out. I mean, a different number is used. So there's all of this distorted stuff online, which is heightening fear to an amazing level. I mean, it's amazing that it can do this, but it's doing it. It's exploiting intrinsic weaknesses in our cognitive function. We're human beings. We're not computers. We're not robots. And this applies to the highly educated, the intelligent, the nerds, the all kinds of people that maybe think they're immune. Not at all. And there's lots of evidence that they're not immune. Not only aren't they immune, in some cases, the high education, the high cognitive power in your mind can actually make you more likely to rationalize, more likely to think in a crazy way. And you can use these cognitive biases that you know about as a way to dismiss the people, evidence, and arguments that would calm you down, that would get you thinking clearly. So it's a paradox. It's not the case that knowing about these things or being able to think better than other people, faster than other people, it not only doesn't immunize you, but it actually can make the problem worse. So, to conclude, it's a serious problem. It is predominantly a mass hysteria, whether by accident or design or some combination of the two. It's very important that people worldwide calm down. Take a deep breath. To do that effectively, you need to unplug from the whole social media environment. Really limit your exposure. Stop using your phone. Stop checking the news. Limit the content you're exposed to. Make sure you end the day and start the day with calm, relaxing content. Try to identify sources of information which are clear-headed and rational, not stoking fear, not the hysterical, hyperbolic headlines, none of that. You don't want that. You want the things that are thinking clearly. You need to think clearly, and you need to calm down. Then you can try to help other people calm down as well. So Happy New Year. It's my hope that we will calm down and deal with the current situation in a more sensible way. You can always hope that the vaccine will work wonders, but we'll see what happens with that. We're already seeing the idea that, it's mutating. So a vaccine only worked for some of it, but we have to stay hysterical. The algorithms, these incentives for these giant companies are going to very likely try to keep the hysteria not only going, but worse and worse. The more eyeballs it brings in, the more the positive feedback they get, the more hysteria, the more emotion and getting people upset. That's the subconscious goal of the recommendation algorithms. They are programmed to get eyeballs, and they're getting eyeballs by freaking people out. So again, Happy New Year. Let's do everything we can to calm down. Take a deep breath. Unplug from the network, from the recommendation engines. Put your phone away. Very much limit what you do with Google or Facebook or any of these things. Focus on calm, rational analysis and really take a hard critical look at the quote data, because it's being cherry-picked and manipulated by the algorithms and probably by people to freak you out. Okay, it's not neutral. It's not just listen to the data or listen to the scientists. In fact, these algorithms know, in a certain sense, that if they package things as, quote, science, they present the data in certain ways, it will freak you out. And, of course, that's what they're doing. And that gets more eyeballs and more money. So, unplug, calm down. Happy New Year. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.